Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez, the CEO and founder of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization that is nurturing a generation of generative men. Today, we have another in-house guest, Curtis Miller, my friend and an individual who's been our closest partner at Epic Project for many years. He's helping us usher in our newest effort called the Better Man Story Initiative. More about that in the coming months. But this effort has been inspired by something Curtis has been saying to me and to us at Epic for years. Positive cultural change happens at the speed of relationships, and relationships happen at the speed of trust. Curtis has shown us that by sharing our stories, men can create and inhabit a true experience of belonging. And that's no small thing. Curtis is the principal consultant at Connect Ed, a program development, evaluation, and training company focused on upstream prevention and interdependent community building. Connect Ed uses narrative processes to improve the mental and emotional and behavioral health of organizations and communities. Curtis lives with his wife in Vancouver, Washington. They have 2 grown children that live in Seattle. He's a reader, a writer, a teacher, a cyclist, a runner, an excellent carpenter, a fixer, and a coffee geek and lover of all things Harley-Davidson. He teaches mental health, first aid, and positive discipline for parents and teachers and community members. He's a national trainer with Sources of Strength Youth Suicide Prevention Program and a founding member of the ACES, Action Alliance Lead Evaluator for the Clackamas County Children's Center on Child Abuse Prevention Initiative, and he has served as an adjunct college professor. In today's episode, Curtis and I talk about, among other things, our long friendship and how the power of storytelling and the innate drive that everyone has to belong caused our professional lives to intersect. You'll love this conversation as you listen to a humble sage who has experienced his own personal crucibles and discovered how even those negative experiences can produce positive, life-giving change. Please remember that this is a conversation that touches on sexual violence, and while it's never our goal to sensationalize the trauma of this topic, we strive to speak truthfully about the damage that is often done. Thanks for joining us today as we explore more of the masculine wilderness.
For today's episode, we'd like to give a shout out to our partner organization, Connected. Connected is a regional organization operating in the realm of community psychology. It offers coaching, training, program development, and evaluation focused on adaptive response, upstream prevention, and promotion of mental, emotional, and behavioral health in individuals, small groups, teams, organizations, communities, and policies. Belonging is the most fundamental human need. We build belonging out of our shared stories. Connected is your guide to increased belonging, transformational story sharing, and a dynamic set of tools to catalyze health and productivity. To learn more, visit connected.buzz. That's connected.buzz.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. This is special for me because I have a personal friend and colleague at Epic, but the friendship is a 30-plus year friendship, and I'm really excited to have him kind of share his heart today. But before I do that, I need to share a personal story of adventure and pain that describes our story. I'm going to tell it, and if I miss anything or if I lie, Curtis, you can correct me on that. But this is Curtis Miller. I'll let him say more about himself in just a second. But in 2022, in the spring, I convinced Curtis to commit to a 3-day motorcycle trip around the back roads of Oregon. It wasn't hard to convince him.
I was going to say that. Didn't feel very manipulative at all.
No, it wasn't at all. And so we headed out on this, picturesque mid-spring morning in June of 2022. Sky was blue. The Pacific Northwest, when it's beautiful, it's as beautiful as anywhere. And we headed east from Vancouver, Washington, up the Columbia River Gorge, through the mountains along the Columbia River. And then we dropped south into this empty but very picturesque desert. If you know the region, it's just stunning, especially when it's green. And we had 2.5 days of some of the best motorcycle riding I've ever done. 700 miles, and we probably had to pass fewer than maybe 20 vehicles.
It was weirdly low number of cars.
We had the road to ourselves, and the first night we stayed near John Day, Oregon, in a teepee at a state park. The second day started out great. We rode couple 100 miles and ended up in this kind of surreal place called Crystal Crane Hot Springs. And it's a lake-sized natural hot spring. And we just sat and soaked for a couple hours and then got back on the bikes.
Well, I'd say we frolicked. There was a little bit of frolicking.
I did not frolic. I don't frolic. I don't think I've ever, well, I may have frolicked once or twice, but not with you.
I swear I remember a pirouette underneath that waterfall.
Yeah, no. If there was frolicking, I wasn't a part of it. So
remember, some of this trip you don't remember.
That's true. There were drugs, and I'll get to that in a second. But we got back on the bikes and we rode west on Oregon State Highway 22. I think the across the desert to the west into Bend, Oregon, which is one of my favorite places on the planet. We were going to camp for the night a little further west and decided to just stay in town in a bed and breakfast in Bend. And we stopped for dinner. And during the last hour or two of the ride into Bend, I started getting a backache, and I have bad back anyway. So at first I ignored it. And then the longer it went on, the more I thought, oh no, it was a very familiar pain. Not at all like a backache. I have had kidney stones my entire life. And as we sat at dinner at the Drake, I do remember this is about when my memory faded. I knew like this is not good. And so we went and checked into the hotel, and I could tell I get my judgment, my decision making starts to be affected by this, the pain. So I thought that the solution to what I knew was a kidney stone attack was to sit in a hot tub again after sitting in hot springs and also drink some bourbon. And so we did that.
Clearly,
and it kept getting worse. And we went to bed, and there were just this little old Airbnb or bed and breakfast. They were too small. It felt like children's beds in the room that we had. And I just started thrashing. And what was it? Maybe 2:00 in the morning, Curtis?
Yeah, I think so.
I heard Curtis and say, "Hey, do you think we need to go to the ER?" And I said without hesitation, yeah. And I was at that point in so much pain, I couldn't bend over to put my shoes on. I still had my bathing suit on from being in the hot tub. And I stumbled out to the street while Curtis called an Uber. We Ubered to the emergency room in Bend. They did their best to, mitigate the pain I was in. They did the ultrasound and found out that the stone was just too big to pass.
That's when the nurse or the PA or whatever said something like, "I've never seen a kidney that looks less bad. It looks like a bag of rocks."
Yep. And I vaguely remember that, but by that time the pain pills were setting in, and it felt like it went on for hours. And I kept telling Curtis, by this time it's 3 a.m. or something like that. I said, dude, just go back and get some sleep. And he says, no, I'll stay here. What I remember in that moment was several times, just, they'll take care of me. You go home and get some sleep. He goes, no, I'm going to stay here. And just that steadfast friendship was the last thing I remember before the drugs set in.
I think I was feeling guilty because I left your shoes at the Airbnb.
But I couldn't even put them on. I remember I had my boots, my riding boots. So I couldn't even put them on.
So you're barefoot.
I'm barefoot in a bathing suit at the ER. Anyway, by about 4:30 or so, the pain had subsided enough. So we Ubered back, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember that, but that's the only.
There was the same guy. There was only one Uber operating it in Bend at 4:00 in the morning.
So we got back to the Airbnb. I think we slept for maybe an hour, and then they had given me some pretty heavy medication, and so I took another dose, knowing that I had a small window of time before it really kicked in, and so we got on the motorcycles. And in between the doses of pain meds, rode, 4.5 hours back to Vancouver.
I followed you feeling somewhat nervous that my stoned friend was on a 700-pound motorcycle.
Oh, no, 950 pounds.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You were on the Indian.
Yeah, and I was literally stoned that whole trip back. But what I remember, the thing that stuck out to me, besides all the pain, was me. I felt like I kept going, just go home. I'll be fine. And you're like, no, I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay here. And I appreciate that steadfastness in our friendship, which has been around a long time. So tell us a little bit about you, kind of where you come from and what you're doing. And then I want to talk about how our lives intersected a long time ago, but our work intersected not too long ago. And it's just a cool story. So Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us your story, Curtis. If I gave you 5 minutes, what could you tell us about yourself?
Tell you my 5-minute life story.
Oh, that sounds like a thing.
Yeah, we should invent something.
We should.
Yeah, I think our work intersected. I mean, in the 80s, we were both doing youth-oriented work with an intention to just figure out how human systems function at a healthy capacity. And
you make it sound like we knew that's what we were doing then, but
I think back then it would have been more like, we can whip these kids into shape. We can help them live healthy lives. If we just take them out to the wilderness for a camp, it'll be okay. Everything will work out.
We were two very idealistic youth pastors back in the day.
I would say the idealism hasn't faded. Perhaps there's been a bit more cynicism that's been added in to temper it a little bit, which can be helpful. The right amount of cynicism balances out overly idealistic efforts. So Tom and I both lived, I'm thinking in terms of like the similarities of our lives and then the coming back together. When you moved back here from Colorado, I had sort of switched gears in my life as well, was leaving 15 years in the construction industry, which I spent most of my energy and focus in the construction industry building community with employees and clients and subcontractors and suppliers, just always trying to have a party and eat pizza together and do weird ceremonies to celebrate things.
It was that same kind of strand of idealism there.
Yeah.
You love to see people connect.
Yeah.
In healthy, life-giving ways. It really didn't matter where you went.
That ended up being a big component of how I ran a construction company. And so when I moved out of the construction industry, I started looking for ways to make social change, got into youth suicide prevention, and realized that as I was studying prevention work, all of the major prevention organizations, and it didn't really matter whether it was suicide prevention or substance abuse prevention or whatever it was, were all saying that connection, belonging, social integration, social capital, all of that kind of stuff, that was the key ingredient that made the difference between individual, relational, organizational, communal, systemic health, and illness. So they all agreed on that, but I couldn't find any of them at that point. And this would have been in late 2010s. None of them actually had any practical application. They didn't say like, okay, so here's how to connect, here's how to build community, because this is the most important thing. They said it was the most important thing, but they didn't give any guidance.
Did they have any theories or did they put forth any ideas?
I really think the practical stuff that is based on that same science, because they were doing the research and coming up with the answer. And the answer was, we need to increase the experience of belonging. We need to help people. People need to be connected. But that's one of the things that I've always been frustrated about with academia is they're really good at saying, here's the problem.
Right.
But very behind the curve when it comes to solutions. That's usually practitioners who are hearing about academics coming, not to throw academics under the bus. I have a lot of respect for those folks. The practitioners are always like, yeah, we know this for years and years and years. Can you do some science around how to actually fix the problem instead of just what the problem is?
Don't you think practitioners too are more likely to be the kind of people that are, sometimes it borders on here, hold my beer while I try this, but
Yeah.
like people who are just willing to
Yeah.
do stuff.
Yeah. Let's
So
try it.
what,
Yeah.
yeah. So what was that? How did that impulse play out for you? Cause now this is within the last 2 decades, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
how did it play out for you? Where did you begin to go, oh, okay, I'm going to try this in this place? What were some of those places where you began to see the potential for it on the ground?
Ironically, it started when I was doing construction work, and I was ending up with a lot of men in my company who were just having a rough time. The construction industry has the highest suicide and substance abuse rates and domestic violence rates, and on and on. Anything in the mental, emotional, behavioral health realm, the statistics in the construction industry are way up at the top, if not the highest. And I was seeing that in my employees and colleagues, and just started talking and recognized that without it being like a counseling session or anything at all, just sharing stories was a really healing experience, hearing each other. And
These are construction dudes. Like these are the working guys. They're not, maybe they would be the self-described manly men,
absolutely.
put on a tool belt and go to work every day. And so I've been in as a low skilled laborer, and you've seen my work, so you know it's true. I've been a low skilled laborer at times in the construction industry. These don't strike me as the kind of guys who would naturally sit around and tell those stories. So what was it that drew that out of them? Just the willingness to share stories.
I think one of the triggers that got us going in that direction, and Mark Martin is a big player, another mutual friend of ours, and he's a thespian. So he was looking at the world through that perspective. But as the company grew and we started ending up with crews and a lot of diverse perspectives in those crews, one of the things that we had to do in order to hit the safety standards that were required by the state was having safety meetings. But one of the things that we knew was problematic about safety meetings is that if you just have the talking points and you go over the stuff that you're supposed to be safe at, it just becomes background noise. And so we were looking for a way to get guys actually engaged in the work that they were doing consciously. And so we started trying to do things that were more inspiring. And some of that ended up being stories about the work that we were doing and what was going on in our lives. There was a connection between the guys that was team building. And I think that's kind of where we started noticing a desire for engagement. I think it's true. The average construction guy is not likely to dive into story sharing, but I think that is because of cultural norms. They're just used to having expectations around stoicism, and anything around sharing feelings is risky because you start getting touchy feely, then you'll get, at the very least an eye roll, and can get much worse.
Oh, I would imagine it'd be much worse than that. Can you authentically share a story without it touching on feelings and emotions?
Yes. And I think that's the starting point, especially for a lot of men. So, we're 15 years down the road now and have spent a lot of time playing with how story sharing works. And I think that's one of the reasons it's such a powerful starting point is telling a story is like writing poetry. You're not supposed to be telling the reader what to think. You're not supposed to be telling the listener to your story what the meaning of the story is. You're just saying, this is the perspective I have of this experience that I had. You don't even need to know your own feelings about it. You can tell a story about what happened and how it affected you. And people listening can draw from that more than oftentimes. I would say the norm, what I've seen happen is that people see you better than you see yourself. It's similar to Lauren's work in photography. We were just talking about that last night, how an accurate view from outside yourself reveals truth about you that you don't see yourself.
It's interesting, having been in those, construction environments, been around those guys a fair amount. The way you describe it, it's like, oh, okay, that feels less intimidating.
Yeah.
And difficult. So I'm curious, is there a story that stands out, like from one of your crew, kind of expresses what you're talking about? Was there a guy that was initially really reluctant and dismissive who came around at one point?
There's so many of them, but the one that pops into my head immediately, there was this guy that worked for us. We won't get into this, but he reached master level in the as a PCR man. His name was Sean, and he at one point before the company shut down, he was running all of our crews. Big hairy guy, bracelets and necklaces and piercings and leather, and looked like a motorcycle guy, but didn't ride a motorcycle. He was probably at least as tall as you, if not taller, probably 6'4", and big. Like, he was a big dude, closing in on 300 pounds. So just in a construction arena, he just fit the bill and
fit right in. Yeah.
Was the image. But he was the one, he communicated with Mark and I more than anybody else that was in the field, because he was sort of the liaison that we were working through. I remember multiple times that he would come and tell us stories of dreams that he had of getting fired or getting in trouble from Mark and I. And he would tell us stories about how he was worried that he was going to get fired, he was going to get in trouble. And it took us probably a year to convince him that there really wasn't any risk of that. He was a genuinely good dude, did good work, probably smoked more weed than we should have let him get away with. I don't know where that part of the story goes, but it was really gratifying to see this guy who had no visible vulnerability get to the point where he could be really honest about his relationship with us and his fears about that relationship and his insecurities about himself, and walk through that with us to where he became really confident and was able to relate to us. We were able to work as a team without that distraction.
Do you think when he would come to you with those, they sound more like nightmares, but was it, do you think he was saying to himself, I know this is just your perspective, but was it a decision on his part to go, okay, I'm going to now be vulnerable? Or did he just say, here's two guys I trust, and I'm going to tell them something that's weighing on me? Because I feel like sometimes that even the word vulnerability, like the V word, is really intimidating. But it feels like, in hearing you share the story, no, he knew he could trust you and Mark.
I think that's what it was. One of the key ingredients is somebody has to be intentional about creating spaces where that can happen. Somebody has to invite vulnerability, and especially in these kind of conditions, in classic male arenas, that invitation isn't, hey, let's get together and share our feelings. It's actually story sharing that includes vulnerability and sets the tone for it.
How did you become the person to do that? Why did you do that?
Well, I think in part it was that idealism. I want to build community. I want to see how this human system can work at high capacity. But I also think it was a self-preservation, a yearning for my own healing, because years before Sean was there, and actually right before Mark showed up, I had decided to quit using my construction company as a way to make money until I could, do something more important in the church realm and just make that the thing that I did. And so, as I tend to do, I created this big dream, this big image of how cool my construction company was going to be. And I was about 35 years old. And right after that, I started having really significant physical symptoms of anxiety that I didn't know were symptoms of anxiety. I thought I had a brain tumor or heart disease or whatever. I had every frickin' symptom that you can imagine. I used to wake up in the middle of the night and I could swear somebody was driving a bulldozer past my house. Like, it felt like everything was shaking. I just came to realize finally that those were stress symptoms. But I was so out of touch with my own emotions that I couldn't connect the stress symptoms with any actual stressor. Like, I couldn't say, I'm anxious because of this thing. It was, generally speaking, I could say, well, there's a lot going on, and maybe.
And at this point, was there anyone around you that could help you navigate that, or
Other than Google? Yeah, which is not actually, I take that back. Like, I did get a lot of comfort out of knowing when I would Google, can stress cause XYZ? There would be a million people out there like, oh yeah, I get this all the time. And I've gone to my doctors and they've tried everything and it doesn't work. It's just stress. And it's like, okay, well, I'm not dying. I'm just stressed, but I still didn't know what to do with it. And so I started talking about it.
Yeah.
And I was dizzy all the time. And I was talking with Mark, I was talking with Sean. And I think me sort of worrying about being worried and being vocal about that. And we were working really hard to build community. So I think the effort towards building team and connectedness, and me talking about my own personal needs and weaknesses and stuff like that, made it a safe place for Sean to say, so I'm kind of freaking out because I keep having this dream and I worry that you guys are going to get mad at me and fire me someday. And by that point, it would have been a bummer because it was really fun. Like, it wasn't just work. We did really cool stuff and had a lot of fun doing it.
You had cool trucks too.
We had really cool trucks. Sean's truck was one of he had the GTO pinstripes and he had flames on his. Yeah. It was
I love that every vehicle had a little bit of customization on it.
Yeah.
That whole idea of creating or holding space for men to just kind of bring themselves and everything that's going on with them, like, that was actually born out of your own personal need.
Yeah.
You needed that. And so you created it for others. Where did that go? What kind of fruit did that produce? I'm more curious about you personally, but also like for your company, because I know the story. It didn't go the way, the script writers.
Yeah, it didn't go according to my plans, which I'm grateful for, because my plans I still would have been in the construction industry. And while I enjoyed my time in the construction industry, I'm very grateful to not be a building contractor anymore. Sean was there when it all came crashing down, and we've remained friends, as well as a lot of the other guys who were involved. We got them set up to run their own smaller companies and did some consulting and all of that. But I kind of went into the desert for a few years and worked at a coffee shop and ran a marathon and finished my bachelor's degree and got involved in that suicide prevention work. And that made me want to figure out more about the story sharing aspect as a practical application, as a way to build connection and belonging and all that kind of stuff.
And so, I could see that thread coming from your experiences as a construction business owner into this. What drew you to that community and that work in suicide prevention? What was a little bit of the backstory of that?
We had lived in Battleground we moved into Battleground in the late 90s. So we'd been there for...
Battleground, Washington.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
No, not a suburb of Vancouver, in case any Battleground people are listening.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you say so.
I just want to be safe.
Okay.
Then we ended up moving into Battleground proper. We'd been sort of on the outskirts. We moved right into town. My wife and I decided we wanted to invest in our community and just sort of figure out how we fit and what we were going to do. And she started working at the school, and I joined the planning commission. I had been working at the coffee shop as sort of a reactionary, when the world comes crashing down, you either be a barista or a bartender. And my wife said I was too cute to be a bartender. So
she has vision problems, doesn't she?
I mean, they say love is blind.
Yeah.
I got a job at a coffee shop, and then I ended up trading partial ownership in the coffee shop for a remodel. And we moved into a old church, and I became the music promoter and was the guy who was firing when people needed to be fired. That became my job for some reason. I don't understand that too, because I'm a really nice guy. I don't know why that would be my job.
Curtis the Hammer.
All the pastors would write their messages at the coffee shop. And so when suicide contagion started in the Battleground School District, the mayor at the time asked me if I would get all the pastors together. And so I started calling pastors, and I said, "Hey, this is Curtis. I'm calling on behalf of the mayor. Would you come to a meeting where we're going to figure out what to do about youth suicide?"
It was disproportional for a small town to have, it was a rash of youth suicides.
Yeah, in the nation at the time, it was Battleground, Washington, and Palo Alto, California, that were having these significant contagions. It was very cutting edge at the time. Actually, the way that the media responded to what was happening shifted based on the experiences that we were having in those two towns. So it's because there's a dangerous way to respond to that kind of stuff. You see spikes in national suicide rates when celebrities kill themselves, and it spreads through a social network in a small community like that. So we really, it's a terrible position to be in, but led the way in figuring out how to respond to that kind of stuff in healthy ways.
What happened when you tried to rally the pastors and bring them together to respond to this issue in Battleground?
Well, who's going to say no to an invitation like that, right? So we ended up with about 80 pastors or church leaders, as well as school board and city council members, all having breakfast at Mill Creek Pub, hosted by Russell Brent, who is friends with the mayor, and she voluntold him to host us. And I didn't find out until the night before that I was actually supposed to be running the meeting. I prayed for guidance, and
you're just a lowly barista.
Yeah, I'm a barista. I'm a failed contractor. I'm still struggling with anxiety. I'm dizzy about half the time. And so here I show up at this meeting, and I had written some notes down on a napkin about what I thought was going on. My conclusion at that point was that kids are just radically disconnected, and they don't know who they are, and their experience, their mental health is being affected by that disconnection. And so I asked the group, what are we going to do about this? What's the problem, and what are we going to do about it? And the conclusion, and then I just put them into groups of 3 or 4 and let them talk it out. Then we did a share out, and at that share out, what it came down to was basically kids are not experiencing belonging. This is not a kid problem. This is a social problem. Kids don't experience belonging because we're not manifesting that in our own community. Our culture is too independent. And so we don't know each other, and we're staying disconnected almost on purpose.
You want to clarify something? So I'm hearing you right. You're using that the idea of disconnectedness and belonging. Those are related terms and can be interchangeable because some of the language I think can be confusing at times.
Yeah, so belonging, which I guess we haven't really talked about what I mean when I say that, but it's much more structural. It's a knowable, measurable thing. Most people, even in the literature now, most of the time when we talk about belonging, we're talking about a sense of belonging or feeling belonging. I'm suggesting that belonging is a fundamental reality. It's the structure of the whole universe. Humans are part of the universe. We're supposed to fit together and matter as individuals in our systems. We don't function that way, though to the rest of the universe does. And so disconnection is sort of the opposite of belonging.
Got it. And so you were seeing that in real time in a small town in Southwest Washington.
Yeah. Yeah.
You brought community leaders together to go, okay, what do we do?
Yeah. And what was great was that they came to the conclusion together without, I didn't tell them. So it really made me feel like, okay, well, this is an instinctive known, this is deeply known by humans. And when we get together, we recognize this togetherness that we're experiencing right now. That's what we need. And so Connect BG, which is what was birthed out of that first meeting, Connect Battleground, was a two-part thing. One was to build a more connected community, because how can we help kids experience connection and belonging if we're not experiencing it? And then two, to develop a caring adult network. So people who are trained and on the same page in how they relate to and support and invite kids into their own experience of belonging. That's where that started, and story sharing was one of our main experiments for helping that happen.
Yeah. So this, give me an idea of the time frame when you started working Battleground. When was that? What year was that?
January of 2013, exactly 5 years to the day. That meeting was 5 years to the day from when I closed down my construction company.
2013. This is part of the story that I love, is that it's ironic, or if you believe in that sort of thing, or fortuitous or serendipitous. But while you were doing that, Epic was just getting underway as well. So while you were looking at addressing, responding to something as tragic as youth suicide, we were just kind of wading into the waters of sexual exploitation and the demand that drives it, the culturally conditioned perspective that many men have that they can purchase sexual access to a woman's body and completely oblivious or not of the damage that's been doing. So we're talking about youth suicide and the trauma of sexual violence against vulnerable people. And so so we were just getting started. When in 2013 again?
January was when we had our first meeting. Yeah.
So in October of that same year, we started our very first cyber patrol, where we went into the online marketplace where sex, the transactions can be bought and sold, and we started directly engaging with buyers. So in that same year, and as that program grew, and as we began learning more, and obviously talking with buyers, we began to learn there was something deep in the hearts, and I want to be careful in parsing this out, because I don't want it to sound like we're excusing the behavior or somehow justifying, the damage done, or letting men off the hook. But we began to realize there's something deep in the hearts of so many of these men. And this is based on, at this point, tens of thousands of actual conversations with men. But we began to realize there's something misfiring here. And we didn't know at the time exactly what it was. But a few years after we started the patrols, and a few years after you started doing your work in Battleground with Connect BG, our professional paths crossed. And I didn't know it at the time. I just said, hey, we're doing a staff retreat. Would you be willing to come and share a little bit about this story thing? What do you remember from that experience?
Well, before our professional paths had crossed, I had started another version of what we had called Man School in my construction company, which was getting guys together to just learn how to be healthy humans.
That's right. Yeah.
And the activity that we shared together, because that's one of the things that's really helpful for men, is if they have something to do. We're not getting together to share our feelings. We're getting together to, build bunk beds for foster kids or build motorcycles and, raffle them off for nonprofits and stuff like that. And so we had started working on motorcycles, which was really my first foray into it. And I restored I think it was an 82 Honda CM 450. That's 450 cc's. And then you said, hey, you should come ride my brother's Honda VTX 1800, which I believe was the most powerful production motorcycle made that year. I can't ride that thing. And you said, oh, sure, it'll be great. And so you finally talked me into it. Do you remember I rode the Honda, my little Honda, to your house.
Got on my big Honda.
Got on Chris's big Honda. And I think we rode it back to my house because I was going to hang on to it and we were going to ride.
Yeah.
And the tires were flat. You remember? I got back.
No, they weren't flat.
I really like it. It just feels kind of unsteady. And found out there was like 15 PSI in the rear tire of this.
I just thought you were just unskilled. That's all.
So we were riding motorcycles and I was in grad school doing an experiment using story sharing to build belonging. So we had been talking about the work that I was doing in the experiment. And so when you had that retreat, you asked me, this was a big favor to me because I needed groups of people, not just men, but groups of people who already had some kind of connection and momentum in their relationships to test out my theories on and measure pre and post and all that kind of stuff. I came to the retreat for city leaders at the coast, and we all sat up in the crow's nest at the Wallam's cabin and ate food that was that guy that was cooking for us. It was just incredible food.
Oh, yeah. I forgot. Yeah.
Anyway, Brad, right?
Brad.
Brad was making food for us and we were drinking bourbon. And I started talking about belonging and bird murmurations and paramecium and all this stuff and how story sharing fit into that.
I think there was some Nature Channel stuff in there too that we were looking at.
Wolves re-inhabiting Yellowstone National Park. I was bebopping along, having a great old time explaining how belonging is just how nature works and all of human problems can be solved if we figure out how to restore belonging in our system. And I noticed that all the guys were like talking to each other. There was all these side conversations going on. I'm like, dude, what's going on here? Like, it's really rude. You're not paying attention to my fascinating talk. They said, this is what we need to do when we're talking to buyers. Because so that's 6 years have gone by since you guys or 5 years had gone by since you guys had started doing the cyber patrols. And these city leaders, with almost no exceptions, had figured out without anybody telling them that catch the bad guys, shame them, punish them, hold them accountable to not doing bad things. It wasn't working.
Which is all we knew at that point.
That's how the system works. You're either bad or good. And if you're bad, you deserve punishment. And if you're good, you deserve reward. So if you're talking to somebody who's different than you, especially that feels that different, like this is a sex buyer and I'm a volunteer trying to stop sex buyers, there's a built-in, it's not instinctive because I don't think it's actually human nature, but it's programmed to say, oh, I'm the good guy and you're the bad guy. But they had done it enough that they were realizing there's actually not that big a difference between me and these bad guys.
Yeah, I mean, as I've reflected on that epiphany in the years since, I've realized, and I think I've said it on the podcast, I've said it elsewhere, the same culture that made sex buyers made me.
Yeah.
There is more in common there. So this happened very kind of organically. We realized the value of it.
They had already started trying different approaches and working on like building connections and inviting people into conversations. Well, we went through the storytelling process with the guys that were there at that retreat with a mind for what that might look like, just barely considering what that might look like as an application to cyber patrols. And so the statistics that I recorded with that group are part of what proved my theory in the end. There was a massive increase in the experience of belonging with those guys at the retreat.
By virtue of sharing stories.
Yeah, we went through.
And so we didn't do anything fundamentally different in sharing our stories than Sean did talking to you and Mark about his dream. And like I guess the point I'm making is we realized the potential, the potency of creating a space for men to share those stories. And it worked within our organization amongst our volunteers, but then we started to see the potential for it in talking to men that are out there trying to buy sex.
Yeah. And Justin was part of that conversation, that original retreat. And then he was going to grad school, and it wasn't much later that he called me up one day. I was driving through Salem, and he said, "Hey, that thing that we did at the retreat that took us a whole weekend, do you think we could squish that down into a 90-second conversation with a guy who's not wanting to have a conversation with us?" And so I said, "Sure, let's try it." And we started working on it.
So I was not there. You and Justin went. There were a couple others as well. I think Brad went
to Kansas City.
Yeah. So tell us about the group of guys, because there's a familiar theme here. It sounds like the PCR guys. So you went to Kansas City to really kind of test this theory in real time with a whole new batch of male volunteers, guys who wanted to combat trafficking. Who were those guys? How did that go?
It was so scary. It was just terrifying. Yeah. So that was the first. So Justin and I created a training that was designed to shift the Cyber Patrol volunteers' approach from catch the bad guy and scare them into being good guys to meet whoever it was that was calling as another valuable human being that's looking for, truly what they're looking for is healthy human connection.
That's so hard to hear when you consider what it is these sex buyers are actually doing, but go on.
Yeah, no joke. They're causing heinous damage to people's lives, including their own. I think one of the things that helps is realizing, like, if this was a 10-year-old kid who was misbehaving, we know that misbehavior of a 10-year-old kid is the result of their training and experience relationally. It's coming from something that's unhealthy in the way that they've been developed. And so we think in terms of, okay, well, how do we help that 10-year-old kid get healthy? We know that punishing them for being a bad kid isn't going to work. They're not being a bad kid. They're just they're expressing what's been invested in them. And these guys who are calling on the phone, they're just older versions, more damaged versions of that same 10-year-old kid.
There's a difference there, though, in terms of their own agency, and like they are making these decisions that they're destroying lives. I mean, how do you navigate that, that tension? Because they're not just 10-year-old boys, doing naughty things. They're 60-year-old dudes trying to buy sex with a 15-year-old girl. It's a order of magnitude difference in the trauma there. So I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, but like there is a common thread, is what you're saying.
I think the saying that the 60-year-old dude who's trying to buy sex, the connection to their 10-year-old self is the brain development. Like, we say they're making bad choices, but they're making bad choices from a limited set of choices. If you've grown up in a society that never teaches you how to be a healthy human being, what we need to hold people accountable to is how to be a healthy human being. It's both a significant and a minor shift. I want to answer the phone and meet a guy and call them into account for who they actually are, who the healthy version of themselves is. I want to grab hold of that guy around the neck and pull him into his authentic self instead of saying you're being bad and knock it off.
How do you respond to the criticism? Because I think we've gotten it before, and we'll probably get it again, that we're being somehow soft on these guys, that we're actually not holding them accountable. How do you respond to that accusation?
I think it's scarier to be held accountable to your true self than it is to be, and I think most people, when they experience being seen, really seen, not the facade, not the pose, not the whatever they've propped up to hide behind, which a guy who's buying sex, they're not being their authentic self. There is no such thing as a human who is actually going to gain health by exploiting and extracting and dominating. That's just not how humans work. It's an aberration. That is a false version of themselves. I think you could say to some extent they're more comfortable. And we've had this experience on calls. Guys wanting to fight for their right to exploit, to dominate, and to extract. They're willing to stick to that as their identity. I would propose it's because that feels safer. But when you get beyond that and you see the guy who is actually there, especially if they've never lived that, you're touching on the vulnerability of that little boy who was left in the dark, who was never acknowledged, who wasn't invested in as a valuable human being. And if we can see that person and call them to accountability, to be that person, that's what we're holding them accountable, is to actually be yourself, which automatically gets rid of sex buying. That's not themselves. It's scarier. In story sharing, this is the point that it often breaks down, is because when we get to if you get a group together and they share stories, and then you get to the point where we're like, okay, let's talk about Tom. Let's talk about Tom's identity. Who is this guy really? And you got a room full of 5 or 6 people, and they're all like shining a light on the core essential self of you. It's a little bit scary.
Oh, yeah.
Very vulnerable, because then you're responsible.
Yeah.
If your peers see you as you actually are, then the next time you're behaving differently than you actually are, they're not saying you're being bad. They're saying you're not being you. And that's hard to move out of.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's also hard to get all the way there in what might be a 90-second conversation,
Sure.
or a 20-minute text thread. This point of intersection with your work and with the work that we're doing is it's been, I would say, monumental for us in terms of really thinking through and thinking deeply about the issue of sexual exploitation. And it's also something that I think men are uniquely suited to do for other men. I'm going back to what you said, back in your construction days, where you wanted to create and curate, really is how I would look at it. You curated a space for that to happen. And this is with varying degrees of success at this point. This is really what we're trying to create for men as we go further into this. And I knew it would happen because I know you need to come back. So you go to Kansas City to try this with a whole new group of guys. And these guys are guys.
Most of them are either current or retired military. There was a professional baseball player in the room. There was a bunch of firefighters. And at least half of the guys in the room were packing, like visibly 9mm sticking out of their waistbands and stuff like that.
Well, I remember it was either you or Justin say, I remember when they just put their gun on the table,
Right.
It's like, all right, go ahead and start.
Yes.
So here's Curtis to talk about vulnerability.
So, and Justin and I walk in, and I'm pretty sure Justin was wearing Tevas with like socks.
Probably.
And torn pants. So a couple of Portland hippies walk into this Kansas City room full of macho dudes. And we're like, okay, we're going to talk about belonging. Anyway, we tried to act tough. We went from our script, and we've been doing this particular thing ever since. And that was 2020. And the first conversation we have is around the differences and similarities between us as the guys in the room, who many of them show up, as Justin says, they show up with a bat. We're gonna catch and beat up the bad guys. When we start talking about like, how did these guys get here and how are we different than them? The difference is none of us can really say, oh, well, we're not bad guys because we made good choices, because we have higher moral standards, because we're more responsible human beings. We're fortunate. The way that we responded to the crises and stressors in our lives and the relationships we have, it generally comes down to the kind of community that we experience, the relationships and community we experience. And so the room usually shifts. And when we get into storytelling, this has happened so many times, where we find out as the guys in the room start sharing their stories that the reason they're there is because they have some kind of experience, whether they realize it or not. They have some kind of experience in their lives that gives them a desire to see this part of our society grow more healthy because they're touched by it. And so, like, we have so many times men who had been former sex buyers, or who had struggled with pornography, or who had even been traffickers themselves. Lots of those kind of stories that show up. Once our stories start to reveal our similarities instead of this massive difference between us, then we realize, well, we have an ability to connect with these men without trying to imagine. Like, we can get it. Rarely do we get the experience where somebody calls and we have this long conversation and everything shifts and it's this miraculous, beautiful thing. But frequently we have a conversation where we get to say things and we get to inject into somebody's life, even in a short period of time, even just by being there present and believing in the potential of another human being and carrying ourselves and speaking in that way, where we get to make a little investment. We don't know where that's going to go. It's something good that has been placed in the life. And maybe that's the catalyst. Maybe that's the thing that makes the shift. And sometimes we get to see it. Sometimes we get to see the shift.
And oftentimes we don't. Yeah. Wow. There's a lot more to unpack. I want to just pose one question to you that will be our stopping point.
All right.
And I feel like this is hitting pause till the next episode, but can you give just a 1-minute riff on the difference between harm reduction and health promotion? Because I feel like that's the shift we're trying to do. We're trying to, not that we're not trying to stop the bad thing, but sometimes the best way to do that is to really plant seeds for the good thing to grow. So just riff on that for just a little bit.
It's really about focus. If we're looking for what's wrong and how to fix it, that's what we're going to be seeing all the time. There's plenty of stuff that's wrong. We can put our attention on that 100% of the time, and we're never going to run out of things that are wrong that require our attention. Even if we just say what's wrong at a crisis level, we can spend all of our time fixing that. But if we go upstream and we look at causes and sources of what causes illness downstream, and we put our attention there. Like if we're investing in that 10-year-old boy, or we're investing in relationships with men who are leaders in their families, leaders in their friend groups, or not even leaders, they're just influences. They're just a presence in their relationships and communities and at work and in their friend groups. And we help them see who they actually are, how to function in healthy ways as they actually are, and have a contagious influence on the people in their lives. We may be cutting off crises that are 6 months or a year or 10 years down the road. We can eliminate multiple sets of problems of harm that could be happening. So we're not giving up on harm reduction by doing prevention work. Health promotion is even a sort of a farther upstream than prevention, because we're just saying, hey, everybody needs to function in this way to be healthy. And every person who's functioning in a healthy way is contributing to the healthy function of the people who they're in relationship with. And we're doing harm reduction down the road by doing health promotion upstream.
That's really good. I know you, and there's a lot more in terms of the influence you've had on our work. So next time I want to let you geek out. Not that it's my place to let you do anything, but I want us to talk more about why we believe this works. We know it experientially, anecdotally, but there's a lot more to that. So we're going to get there. But for now, what strikes me, and I'll end on this. This will be my last thought, and then I want to give you the last word. But your idealism has matured like really good bourbon over the years. You're like there's a thread here, and it continues. So I just really appreciate that about you. But I want to give you the last word. Pose a question, if you will, that we should, as men and the people that love them, what's the question we should be asking right now?
The thing that drives the character in every story is what they want. The they being their true essential selves and the core desire of that essential self. And I think that's one of the things that our culture has not done a good job of asking, let alone making room for the answer. I ask this question a lot. What do you want? And when we get past, I want a red Ferrari or a house in the Hamptons,
a new Harley.
Yeah, a new Harley. When we start getting past all that stuff, a lot of times men get really pissed because
I did when you started asking that question.
Yeah, we haven't been given space to consider that. And if you're 50 years old and you've never thought about what you want, it's upsetting, not just emotionally. It's like, okay, well, how do I make sense of all of the energy and time and money and stuff that I've spent to get where I'm at now, or to accomplish or to achieve or whatever? How does that make any sense if I've never actually considered who I am and what I want? So I think what do you want is the beginning question. That gets to who you are. That's a good thing to dig into with people who know you or people that you want to know.
Curtis Miller, you have been, and continue to be a blessing to me personally and to our work. So thank you. But we'll talk later.
All right. It's mutual, my friend. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.